Williamsburg, Virginia. November 7th, 1730. A court hears the kind of theft that, on paper, looks small enough to dismiss. 3 sheets, 40 shillings. Until you remember what Virginia law was designed to protect and what it was designed to discard. 3 sheets are not cloth in a colony built on forced labor. They are order. They are inventory. They are the household's clean face. And in the colonial ledger, an enslaved woman is not a person accused. She is property that has malfunctioned. Her name is Mary Aggie. Sometimes you see it spelled Aggie. Sometimes you don't see a last name at all, because the record didn't need her to be whole. The record only needed her to be usable. If you are listening from somewhere far away, you might imagine the crime and think it ends here. Verdict, sentence, punishment. In Virginia in 1730, for someone like her, that is the expected ending. The expected ending is a body corrected by the state and then quietly removed from the story. But that's not what happens. And when a colonial system deviates from its own routine, you should stop pretending it's mercy. You should ask what it is buying. I want you to picture how this story is usually told when it's safe enough to be told. A footnote in legal history. A curious colonial case. A moment where the law evolved. Mary Aggie becomes a line that helps explain an Old English privilege with an Old English name. Benefit of clergy. A relic. A technicality. Something for scholars. Something that sounds almost quaint, like parchment, like powdered wigs, like the polite language of courts. But in 1730 Virginia, benefit of clergy is not quaint. It is the difference between death and continued existence. And continued existence does not mean freedom. It means survival under terms that are never negotiated with the person whose life is at stake. The coldest part of this record is not the theft. It's the way the system solves its embarrassment. Because Mary Aggie is convicted in York County by a court of oyer and terminer, a court convened for serious criminal cases, the sort that end with hanging or the kind of corporal punishment that leaves a body as a warning. She is supposed to be an example. That is what the colony does to keep its hierarchy intact. But the colony also needs to keep its own face intact. And this is where the paper trail begins to behave like an animal that knows it has been seen. April 1731. The case rises. It is argued before the general court. Attorneys, 4 of 5 arranged for her, stand up and insist that Mary Aggie has the right to plead benefit of clergy. Pause on that. Not because it's inspiring, because it's revealing. In a colony where enslaved people are recorded as assets, the administration still stages an argument about her rights, selectively, strategically, because someone powerful wants the law to say something it doesn't yet say. That powerful person is Lieutenant Governor William Gooch. Now understand what that means. Gooch is not a distant symbol. He is a presiding authority. He is the type of man whose signature turns into policy. And in this story, he does not appear as a benevolent savior. He appears as a manager of outcomes. He presides over her earlier attempt to sue for freedom in the late 1720s, an attempt that fails. Then, when she is convicted in 1730, he moves again. He is the hinge. He is the reason the machine pauses. He is the reason this record becomes a precedent instead of an execution. And that should make you uncomfortable, because it means Mary's life is not spared by principle. It is spared by utility. Here is the moment where the archive shows you its teeth. When it comes time for the general court to rule in April 1731, the bench divides, 6-6. A deadlock. You can call it uncertainty. You can call it legal complexity. But the split is not about whether benefit of clergy existed. It did. The split is about whether the colony is willing to let a person like Mary Aggie touch it. A tied bench is not just indecision. It's the law staring at its own racial boundary and hesitating over whether to draw the line with blood or with procedure. So Gooch does what administrators do when the room is split. He escalates. He orders the case referred to England. That referral sounds like due process. It sounds like care. It sounds like the Empire taking a careful look. But a referral is also a stall. A referral is also a way to move responsibility upward while keeping control of the person downward. Mary does not become more protected as the paperwork climbs. She becomes more vulnerable because the longer the system deliberates, the longer she remains trapped inside it with no ability to exit on her own terms. Then comes May 6th, 1731. And this is the sentence that should ring in your skull, because it is where the colony's mercy reveals its true shape. Lieutenant Governor Gooch and the Governor's Council pardon Mary Aggie. Pardon. That word is thrown like a blanket over violence, so you'll stop looking for the bruise. But read the condition. She is pardoned on the condition that she leave the colony to be sold elsewhere as a slave. That is not a pardon. That is disposal. That is removal. That is exile without citizenship, transportation without consent, a forced erasure dressed up as compassion. She is not freed. She is exported. The colony does not release her from bondage. It releases itself from the inconvenience of her case. It gets to say, "We spared her," while ensuring she will not be present to complicate the social order. The person who forced the system to reveal its contradictions is not allowed to remain where those contradictions could be remembered. And this is the cold open, because this is the discovery. The record saves itself by eliminating the witness. Listen carefully to how this works. In an enslaved woman's earlier freedom suit, she demonstrated her belief in Christianity to the satisfaction of the presiding judge, Gooch. That detail survives in summaries for a reason. It is treated as proof of her character, proof of her eligibility for mercy, proof that the court had a conscience. But I want you to hear it the way a prosecutor hears it, as a criterion imposed by power. Mary's Christianity is not just faith in a church. In the hands of colonial administration, it becomes a credential, an exam she did not choose, graded by men whose world required her submission. If she passed, it did not make her equal. It made her useful. And the consequence of being useful is not safety. It is being used. Now, if you expected me to tell you we'll find out where she was sold, to whom, and whether she survived, stop. That is not how the archive treats someone like Mary Aggie. The system is meticulous about its own decisions and careless about her fate. It records the value of the sheets. It records the dates of proceedings. It records the tally of judges, 6-6. It records the council's pardon. It records the condition that she be sold out of the colony. Then it stops. A life becomes a legal instrument, and once the instrument has done its work, the hand drops it. This is what silence as policy looks like in its earliest form. Not a gap caused by fire or water or time, but a gap caused by intention. The colony does not lose her in the record accidentally. It loses her in the record as a method. And if you're wondering why this matters, why dig into the life of one enslaved woman whose name appears only because she collided with the law? Here is why. Because her disappearance becomes productive. It produces a statute. It produces a legal shift. It produces a new way for Virginia to talk about mercy while tightening control over the people least able to claim it. Now we move into what people think they know, and what they were trained to overlook. The official story is clean. It says Mary Aggie was a slave involved in a court case that changed Virginia's statute law. It says she sued for freedom in 1728 and lost. It says she was convicted of stealing from her owner in 1730. It says Gooch sought benefit of clergy for her, and the case went up. It says she was pardoned in 1731 on condition she be sold out of the colony. And it says that in 1732 the General Assembly passed a law expanding the ability to plead benefit of clergy for virtually all Virginians, continuing for decades. This is the version of history that lets you admire institutions. It lets you talk about progress. It lets you pretend the system's conscience gradually awakened. But that's not what the receipts show. The receipts show a pattern. The law expands in language at the same time it narrows in practice. The receipts show that when the colony needed to preserve itself, it could suddenly find procedural generosity, suddenly find attorneys, suddenly find arguments, suddenly find a path to spare a life. And the receipts also show that the price of that procedural generosity was removal. The solution was not to recognize Mary as a person within Virginia. The solution was to push her out, sell her away, and then use her case to rewrite the rules for everyone else. That is not justice. That is reputation management. And you can hear it in the rhythm of the story. First comes the freedom suit in the late 1720s. An enslaved woman attempts to sue for her freedom and fails. That failure is the colony speaking plainly. You cannot climb out. Then comes the theft conviction on November 7th, 1730. The colony speaks again, even more plainly. You can be killed for disturbing property relations. Then comes the legal scramble in 1731. The colony speaks in a different tone, not because it has softened, but because it has discovered a complication. The complication is not the sheets. It is not even Mary's faith. The complication is that executing her cleanly might create the wrong kind of precedent, the wrong kind of question, the wrong kind of attention. So the colony chooses a third language. Procedural mercy paired with forced exile. It spares her body from one form of violence by handing her to another, and then it closes the book. That closure is the policy. The closure is the point. From here, we're going to hold two archives side by side. The official archive is what the colony wanted preserved. Dates, charges, court names, statutes, executive actions. The human archive is what the colony wanted dissolved. What it meant to be an enslaved woman in Williamsburg, recorded as property, graded for Christianity, threatened with death for linen, then pardoned by being sold away until even her shadow cannot testify. And every time the official archive congratulates itself, every time it says, "Look, we allowed mercy. Look, we expanded rights. Look, we modernized procedure," we will ask the question the record does not want asked. Who paid for that cleanliness? Who was removed so the institution could keep its hands looking washed? Because the moral responsibility here is not to admire the statute. It is to remember the person the statute consumed. Mary Aggie's name survives not because the colony valued her, but because the colony briefly needed her. That is the first indictment. The second indictment is what happens next. After she is sold out of Virginia on May 6th, 1731, she becomes untraceable in the official story. Her life is traded for a legal adjustment. The colony gets to continue speaking about mercy while keeping the enslaved safely outside the circle of memory. So when you hear her name, do not hear an anecdote. Hear an alarm. Hear a system that learned it can turn a person into a lever, pull hard enough to move the law, and then throw the lever away before anyone asks what it cost. You can't understand what happened to Mary Aggie by staring at her alone. The colony did not treat her as a lone story. It treated her as a problem that touched three separate systems at once: the law that pretended to be English, the economy that was openly enslaving, and the government that was always calculating what the record would look like later. When those systems collide, they don't produce truth. They produce a solution. And the solution is usually written down in the calmest handwriting you've ever seen. So let's talk about how this project begins, because make no mistake, by the time Mary's case reaches the higher court in 1731, it is no longer just about 3 sheets. It has become procurement. It has become optics. It has become governance. The phrase benefit of clergy sounds like a religious perk. It isn't. It's a legal escape hatch inherited from England, a mechanism that once separated clerics from secular punishment and then widened into something else. A privilege tied to literacy, to the ability to perform learning as innocence. In other words, a gate. And Virginia, in the early 18th century, is obsessed with gates. Gates between white and black. Gates between free and enslaved. Gates between Christian and heathen, because the colony wants the moral language without the moral obligations. The colonial leadership does not fear sin the way it fears disorder. It fears anything that suggests enslaved people might claim standing, personhood, or rights that cannot be contained. This is where the incentives begin. Lieutenant Governor William Gooch is not operating in a vacuum. He is operating in a colony that must constantly prove itself to the empire. It must prove it can govern. It must prove it can discipline. It must prove it can protect property. It must also prove it can sound like law, not just violence. That last part matters, because raw violence is expensive. Raw violence invites attention. Raw violence requires explanation. A clean procedure is cheaper. A clean procedure produces paperwork that future officials can point to and say, "We followed the rules." So here is the first brutal truth. Mary Aggie becomes legible to the colony at the precise moment she threatens to become inconvenient. By 1730, she is already in the colonial orbit. There are records placing an enslaved adult woman named Mary Aggie in Williamsburg in 1717 as the property of Susanna Allen. That matters not because it gives her life depth, though it does, but because it shows how the archive frames her from the beginning. As a possession attached to a household, not as a person attached to a family. Williamsburg is the political heart of the colony. It's where the leadership lives and performs authority. It is where messages are sent, laws are debated, and reputations are manufactured. If a case becomes noisy here, it can't be dismissed as a distant plantation problem. It sits too close to the seat of power. It smears the floorboards. Now jump forward to the late 1720s. Mary Aggie attempts something most enslaved people are not expected to attempt. She sues for her freedom. She loses. That failure is the official story. But the hidden story is the second layer. She appears before the presiding authority and demonstrates Christianity to his satisfaction. Think about what the colony is doing when it records that. It isn't praising her soul. It is collecting a credential. It is classifying her. It is deciding which narrative she can be fitted into later. Then November 7th, 1730. The theft conviction. 3 sheets valued at 40 shillings from the house of her owner, Annie Sullivan, a tavern keeper in Williamsburg. 40 shillings is not just money. It's a legal threshold that turns a property dispute into a capital offense. It is the state's way of saying, you do not steal from a master, you steal from the social order. For an enslaved person, the punishment is supposed to be exemplary. Death or severe corporal punishment. The colony's first instinct is always the same. Make the body teach the lesson. And then the project begins. Leadership searches for an elegant solution. An elegant solution is what bureaucracies call a decision that makes the record look clean. If Mary is executed, the record is clean in one way: crime, punishment, closure, but it risks creating another mess. The question of why she was not allowed to plead benefit of clergy, a privilege the colony is simultaneously using for others. If Mary is spared, that creates a mess too, because sparing an enslaved woman for a felony threatens the performance of absolute mastery. Either way, the colony risks looking inconsistent. Inconsistent law is dangerous because it invites petitions. It invites comparison. It invites the wrong people to believe the system can be argued with. So Gooch reaches for the tool that produces the least mess. Procedure. He attempts to secure benefit of clergy for Mary. Again, do not romanticize it. This is not a sudden burst of empathy that overcomes a slave regime. This is a man managing what the case could become. He arranges attorneys for her, an action that sounds extraordinary until you remember who benefits. If the colony can shepherd this case into a precedent that strengthens its control over mercy, it controls more than Mary's sentence. It controls the future distribution of punishment. This is procurement. Not of goods, but of outcomes. Look at the constraints leadership is working under. Budget and timeline, yes, even in law. The colony does not want a prolonged spectacle. It wants this resolved before it becomes a narrative that spreads. An enslaved woman forced the court to argue about rights. Political optics, because Williamsburg is not a private courtroom. It is a place where rumor travels faster than documents. And imperial optics, because Virginia is always being watched by an England that expects colonists to behave as administrators, not as mobs. So the elegant solution becomes a sequence. Elevate the case. Frame it within English legal tradition. If the higher court balks, defer to England. If delay becomes dangerous, close the matter with executive power and remove the problem physically. That is exactly what happens. By April 1731, 4 of 5 attorneys argue before the general court that Mary Aggie has the right to plead benefit of clergy. The bench deadlocks 6-6. This tie is not incidental. It is the sound of a system stalling because it cannot agree on how much personhood it can safely simulate. Gooch orders referral to England. On paper, it looks like procedural care. In practice, it's a tactic. Move the pressure away from Williamsburg. Push the decisive moment into a distant channel. Buy time. But the colony cannot leave it unresolved. The longer Mary remains in limbo, the more her case exists. And existence is what the system is trying to contain. So on May 6, 1731, Gooch and the council pardon her, conditionally, on the condition that she will be sold out of the colony. This is the procurement contract, signed in bloodless ink. Mary's life in exchange for her removal, the colony's reputation in exchange for her disappearance, a legal precedent in exchange for a human being shipped away like surplus. Now we move to the workforce, because this machinery is never run by one man alone. It runs because many people perform their roles without needing to call themselves villains. Who did the work and who paid the price? Not just Mary. Everyone like her, the enslaved people who lived under a legal system that counted sheets and shillings precisely while counting black lives loosely. The workforce is the enslaved population of Williamsburg and Virginia, more broadly. Women and men recorded in household inventories, in tavern accounts, in court dockets, in tax lists, often reduced to first names, ages, and valuations. Their identities are not preserved because the system doesn't need identities to extract labor. It needs bodies. And when those bodies appear in legal records, look at how they are recorded. Numbers, categories, labels, slave, Negro, property of. These phrases are not description. They are weaponry. They are the language of erasure, designed to do two things at once: make the person administratively manageable, and make the violence feel procedural rather than moral. Compare how the privileged are written down. Lieutenant Governor William Gooch is written with titles, with offices, with authority that persists on the page. Council members are preserved through institutional continuity. Judges are named. Attorneys are implied through their professional identity. Owners are named with trades and status. Annie Sullivan, tavern keeper, so the reader understands she matters. The enslaved person is named only enough to attach her to an owner and an offense. That difference is not accident. It is design. So let's insert the microportraits the official record tries to flatten, because remembering is not sentimental, it is corrective. Mary Aggie, an enslaved adult woman in Williamsburg's orbit by at least 1717, likely the same person who later becomes central to two cases between 1728 and 1731. Her defining features in the archive are not her loves or fears. They are her attempted freedom suit, her proof of Christianity, and her felony conviction. Her humanity is reduced to 3 points of interaction with power: petition, punishment, disposal. Annie Sullivan, a Williamsburg tavern keeper, owner of the house from which the sheets are taken. In a port town and political capital, taverns are hubs. They are where transactions happen, where men talk, where stories circulate. When property goes missing from a tavern keeper, it is not just a personal grievance. It becomes a public signal. Order is threatened. That amplifies the case. It makes severity more likely. It makes leadership more anxious to close it without looking weak. William Gooch, the presiding authority who simultaneously uses Christian legitimacy and racial control. He is the man who wants the colony to sound like English law while practicing colonial slavery. That tension is his daily job. In Mary's case, he is not merely judging, he is steering. He arranges counsel, attempts to secure benefit of clergy, escalates to England, then resolves with a conditional pardon that expels the person at the center. He manages the record so the institution can claim mercy without granting belonging. And now hear the pattern that forms when you place these portraits together. The privileged remain in place. The disposable are moved, replaced, erased. The record is stable for those with titles and unstable for those with chains. That instability is not chaos. It is policy. This is how the colony's erasure works at the workforce level. Enslaved people appear in records when they are bought, sold, taxed, punished, or litigated. In between, they vanish into labor. When they die, their deaths are often absorbed into the household economy or plantation accounting without ceremony. When they are transported, they become someone else's problem. When they are sold out of the colony, the archive becomes a closed door. You can stand outside it forever and still not see through. So when you hear that Mary Aggie's case changed Virginia statute law, do not hear it as progress. Hear it as extraction. The colony extracted a legal adjustment from her life, then exported the evidence, her body, her presence, her future, so the adjustment could stand without contradiction. And that is the accusation I am laying down. The colony did not merely punish Mary Aggie. It used her as a lever to recalibrate who gets to survive the law, and under what conditions. Then it removed her so the recalibration would not require accountability. If you want to understand the horror of this story, stop picturing a gallows. Start picturing a page with clean margins and a sentence that ends a life without describing it. Pardoned on condition she leave the colony to be sold elsewhere. That line is the workforce policy in miniature. It tells you what Virginia was willing to do to keep its hands clean. It would outsource the blood, export the inconvenience, and keep the statute. And we are not allowed to let that be the end of what we remember. The records will never sit you down and describe Mary Aggie's mornings. They won't tell you how her hands looked after years of laundering, scrubbing, carrying, lifting, or serving. They won't tell you what her back felt like in winter damp, or how her lungs handled smoke and mildew, or how hunger changes the way a person measures risk. The archive is too polite for that. It prefers to speak in totals, in categories, in values. It will tell you 3 sheets as if that phrase contains the full violence of the event. It doesn't. But we can still reconstruct the conditions, not by invention, not by romance, by listening to what the paperwork refuses to name. Williamsburg in the early 18th century is the colony's showcase. It is where governance is performed in public, where titles and coats and sermons and court sessions create the illusion of a moral order. But that moral order is propped up by human labor that is deliberately kept off stage. Enslaved people clean the rooms where lawmakers debate. They cook the food that sustains the men who draft statutes. They haul water, wash linens, serve drink, carry messages, and maintain the physical calm that the colony markets as civilization. The record calls this property. The record treats it as a background hum. But background hum is still produced by bodies. Now narrow the lens to what the record does tell us. Mary Aggie is in Williamsburg's orbit at least by 1717, likely in the household economy of Susanna Allen, and later attached to another household, Annie Sullivan, a tavern keeper. That shift alone tells you something about her life conditions. Being held by a tavern keeper in the colonial capital does not mean safety. It means visibility. It means proximity to strangers, transactions, alcohol, and the constant flow of talk. It means a domestic space that is also a commercial space. It means the boundary between house and workplace is erased, because the enslaved person is treated as a tool that can be moved from room to room and from task to task without permission. And in those spaces, linens matter. Sheets are not decoration. They are the colony's hygiene and its respectability. They are also expensive. The record gives us the valuation. 40 shillings. That valuation is the coldest clue, because it tells you the colony will calculate the worth of cloth more carefully than the worth of the woman who handled it every day. The sheets are not only property, they are a legal trigger. Once the value crosses a threshold, the theft becomes a felony that can bring death. In other words, the colony has built a system where survival can hinge on an accountant's number. So when the record says Mary Aggie stole 3 sheets from Annie Sullivan's house, it is not describing a moment of greed. It is describing a collision between conditions and punishment. You don't steal linens in a vacuum. You steal when you are cold. You steal when you are trying to sell something for food. You steal when someone you care about is sick and needs covering. You steal when you know you're already being treated as disposable, and you decide to take a risk because the daily risk of living under that regime has already become unbearable. The archive will not confirm which of these reasons is true for Mary. That is intentional. Ambiguity protects the institution. But the surrounding reality is not ambiguous. Enslaved people are underfed, overworked, and legally vulnerable by design. The law is not a shield for them. It is a blade held above them. Now let me show you the cruelty without melodrama. The cruelty is in the way the paperwork would have framed her daily conditions if it bothered to frame them at all. Provided rations. Assigned quarters. Corrected. Sent for care. Administrative language that turns deprivation into management. When an enslaved person is sick, the system does not say illness. It says unfit. When an enslaved person collapses, the system does not say starvation. It says unable. When an enslaved person resists, the system does not say desperation. It says insolence. This is what I mean when I say the archive is an accomplice. It launders the violence by laundering the language. And here is where the first major incident enters the record as an event rather than a life. November 7th, 1730. York County Court of Oyer and Terminer. Mary Aggie is convicted of stealing 3 sheets valued at 40 shillings from the house of her owner, Annie Sullivan. In Virginia, a theft like that for someone like her typically ends in death or severe corporal punishment. The system is not shy about that. It has been built to make enslaved people afraid not only of punishment, but of the unpredictability of punishment. Fear works best when it is both severe and arbitrary. So what should have followed is routine. Sentence. Execution or mutilation. Closure. A clean record. Instead, we get something else. A sudden interest in procedure, a sudden insistence on a privilege that is supposedly tied to literacy and Christian legitimacy. This is where the story becomes truly ugly, because the colony uses mercy to hide its own anxiety. I want you to notice the timing. Late 1720s. Mary Aggie sues for freedom and loses. That case places her in a courtroom where Lieutenant Governor William Gooch presides and finds her Christianity convincing. That detail becomes a credential stored in the administrative memory. Then 1730. She is convicted of felony theft. Now, in 1731, Gooch attempts to secure benefit of clergy for her. The colony is suddenly willing to treat her as a legal subject, conditionally, because it wants to treat her as a legal instrument. And while the record won't give you a dramatic diary entry from Mary, it does provide the outsider witness voice in a different form. The courtroom itself. Courts are institutions with a voice. Their voice is procedure. Their voice is what they allow to be argued. And, in April 1731, the General Court allows argument that Mary Aggie has the right to plead benefit of clergy. 4 of the 5 attorneys arranged for her argue the point. That is not the colony spontaneously expanding humanity. That is the colony testing how far it can stretch English legal tradition without tearing the colonial hierarchy. Now let's talk about what the record doesn't describe but cannot hide. The conditions of discipline that hang over this whole sequence. In a slave society, discipline is not merely punishment after a crime. It is constant. It is the everyday demonstration that the enslaved person has no safe zone. The owner's house is not private refuge. It is the workplace, the surveillance zone, the threat zone. The tavern is not a public space where rules apply equally. It is a public space where the enslaved person's vulnerability multiplies. The court is not neutral. It is the owner's instrument with ceremonial robes. So when Mary is convicted, she is already living inside a regime that assumes her guilt before she speaks. When the record later notes that she has demonstrated her belief in Christianity, you should not read it as the colony granting dignity. You should read it as the colony searching for a label that will let it control the optics of whatever it chooses to do next. And here is the first vanishing, the first substitution in the ledger, the first anomaly that should make your skin crawl. Mary's punishment is not written as a final, fixed thing. It becomes fluid. It becomes negotiable. Not because she has bargaining power, but because the administration is bargaining with itself. Normally, after a felony conviction like this, the colony would have one story. Justice was done. But now it risks having two stories. Justice was done. And the law was inconsistent. That second story is dangerous because inconsistency is what enslaved people, free poor people, and anyone without power might try to exploit. If law can bend, people might push. So leadership needs to control how the bend is explained. This is where the ledger begins to substitute outcomes. Look at the sequence again. Convicted, November 7th, 1730. Arguments. April 1731. Split bench, 6-6. Referral to England. Then May 6th, 1731. Gooch and counsel. Pardon her on the condition she be sold out of the colony. Notice what is missing. A final verdict at the General Court on her eligibility for benefit of clergy. The bench is tied. The colony cannot secure a clean legal precedent in time, so it uses executive power to force a clean narrative exit. The pardon is not a legal resolution, it is an administrative eraser. In other words, the law cannot decide whether to spare her through procedure, so the government spares itself through removal. This is why I call it substitution in the ledger. Because the colony replaces the messy truth, an enslaved woman forcing the highest court into a deadlock, with a neat outcome. Pardon, transport, sale. The people in power keep their authority intact. The doctrine of hierarchy stays undisturbed, and the public can be told a story that sounds compassionate. Meanwhile, Mary is physically removed from the jurisdiction where anyone might continue to ask about her rights. And then comes the most dangerous question in this case, the one that turns this from legal history into buried record horror. Where did she go? Sold out of the colony is not a destination. It is a disappearance clause. It tells you the colony wanted her absent. It does not tell you whether she was sold north, south, west, to the Caribbean, to another port, to another owner with another name, to a place where she would be worked harder, punished more, raped, broken, killed, or simply absorbed into another record as another first name without a last name. The phrase is designed to end curiosity. It is designed to satisfy the paperwork and starve the human mind. And if you think that is an accident of incomplete documentation, you are still being too generous. Colonial governments were capable of meticulous shipping records and commercial accounting when money was involved. The fact that Mary's after dissolves is not proof that nothing was recorded. It is proof that nothing was preserved for her. Now, let's lay out the anomaly in the form it matters. The colony records the value of the stolen sheets, but does not record the value of the life it exports. It records the deadlock of judges, but not the deadlock of conscience. It records the pardon date, May 6, 1731, because that date protects the reputations of the men who signed it. It does not record the date she left, the ship, the buyer, the sale terms, the destination, because those details would transform mercy into what it really is: forced displacement and continued bondage. That is the first vanishing. Not the vanishing of a body into a grave, but the vanishing of a person into paperwork. The colony does not need to kill her to erase her. It only needs to move her beyond the boundaries of its own memory and then close the file. And here is the moral hinge I will not soften. When institutions can turn human beings into administrative problems, they solve those problems with administrative tools. They do not ask what is right. They ask what is sustainable. They ask what will leave the least stain on the record. They ask what future officials can defend with a sentence or two. Sold out of the colony is that sentence. It is efficient. It is clean. It is the language of a policy that values silence more than life. So when you hear the case described as a moment that changed Virginia's statute law, remember this. The change is built on an erased endpoint. The law gets its paper trail. The men get their titles. The colony gets its narrative of controlled mercy. Mary gets a condition that functions like a trapdoor, and then she is gone. And we are not allowed to let that be the end. Because the point of telling buried record history is not to admire how the archive works. It is to name what the archive does. It counts cloth. It counts shillings. It counts votes, 6 to 6. It counts statutes later. But when it comes to the woman at the center, it stops counting. That stopping is not a gap. It is a decision. It is silence as procedure. There is a window in this story where the paperwork accelerates, where decisions that usually take their time suddenly compress into weeks, then days. That's the crisis window, the moment when the colony stops behaving like a machine that punishes and starts behaving like a machine that contains. And if you want to know when Virginia felt exposed, you don't look for a riot in the streets. You look for unusual motion in the record. Sudden elevation of jurisdiction, sudden legal talent assembled, sudden escalation to England, then a sudden executive pardon that removes the person at the center before the court can even finish speaking. April 1731 is that window. It is not summer heat in a literal sense, it's administrative heat. It's pressure rising inside the walls of a capital that cannot afford to look uncertain about who the law is for. By April 1731, Mary Aggie's case is no longer local. It has been dragged upward into the general court, because that is where the colony can attempt something it wants badly. A clean, authoritative statement about benefit of clergy that still preserves hierarchy. The phrase benefit of clergy is the colony's elegant tool because it sounds like mercy with rules. Mercy with rules is safe. It is measurable. It is printable. But Mary Aggie is the kind of subject that breaks elegant tools, because her very presence raises the question the colony cannot answer out loud. Can an enslaved woman touch a privilege that was built to spare lives within the circle of recognized humanity? If the answer is yes, the circle expands. If the answer is no, the colony must explain why the Christian language it uses to justify itself does not apply to a Christian enslaved person. Either answer stains someone. Either answer produces a precedent that will be remembered. And the colony does not want this to be remembered in the wrong way. So the general court hears arguments. 4 of the 5 attorneys arranged for her insist she has the right to plead benefit of clergy. Stop and stare at that detail again, because it is the scream inside the archive. Enslaved people were not routinely furnished with organized legal advocacy by the state's top leadership. When that happens, it tells you Mary's case is being used as a vehicle. A vehicle needs handlers. A vehicle needs a route. This is the route. Take a condemned enslaved woman, reframe the proceeding as a doctrinal question, and see if the colony can manufacture a ruling that looks like English legality while keeping slavery unthreatened. That is the peak event window, the moment the system tries to turn a human crisis into a policy opportunity. But the bench divides. 6 to 6. A tie is not neutral. A tie is a confession that the institution cannot make its own violence look consistent. A tie means half the court sees the danger of granting the plea and half sees the danger of denying it. And in that deadlock you can hear both fears at once. Fear 1. If the plea is granted, enslaved people may learn the law can be invoked, not merely suffered. Fear 2. If the plea is denied, the colony will look like it is rejecting its own claimed principles of Christian civilization and English jurisprudence. The colony wants to punish without looking barbaric. It wants to claim moral order while practicing coerced labor as the foundation of wealth. Mary Aggie forces those two faces to share a mirror. So Lieutenant Governor William Gooch does what a man does when a room refuses to give him an answer he can use. He orders the case referred to England. That referral is usually narrated as procedural prudence, as if the empire's distance makes it wiser. But functionally, referral is a pressure valve. It takes heat off Williamsburg. It postpones the moment where Virginia must declare, in its own voice, whether an enslaved woman is eligible to be spared by a privilege associated with literacy and scripture. It is also, importantly, a way to transform a moral conflict into a bureaucratic cue. If you can delay a decision long enough, you can often replace it with another mechanism. And Virginia has another mechanism: executive power and forced removal. This is where the record's cruelty becomes almost mathematical, because the colony cannot leave Mary in suspense indefinitely. Suspense is unstable. Suspense creates talk. Suspense invites sympathy. Suspense invites questions from the wrong mouths. A condemned enslaved woman lingering in the legal apparatus of the capital is not just a prisoner. She is a rumor with a docket number. She is a living contradiction. The longer she exists within Virginia's jurisdiction, the longer the colony must carry the burden of deciding what her life means to its laws. So the crisis window slams shut with a decision that looks, on paper, like mercy. On May 6, 1731, Gooch and the Governor's Council pardoned Mary Aggie on the condition that she leave the colony to be sold elsewhere as a slave. Read that again until the word pardon stops comforting you. This is not forgiveness. This is not restoration. This is administrative quarantine. The colony does not want the precedent of her execution, and it does not want the precedent of her legal inclusion. So it chooses a third path that preserves its control. Spare her life but remove her body, remove her voice, remove her future from Virginia's reach. The colony gets to claim the aesthetic of mercy without accepting any of mercy's moral obligations. It does not lift her out of bondage. It transfers her bondage beyond the colony's memory. And now we reach the point in the story where people always want a dramatic artifact. A letter, a confrontation, someone slamming a fist on a desk demanding answers. They want a single piece of paper they can point to and say, "There." That's the moment. Real systems rarely give you that gift. They don't need to. Pressure can be applied without theatrical confrontation. It can be applied through networks, through favors owed, through reputational threat, through the quiet calculus of elites who know each other and know what can be whispered. The archive does not always preserve those whispers. But you can trace the pressure by watching how quickly power moves when power is at risk. And in Mary Aggie's case, power moved fast. First, look at who had leverage. Annie Sullivan, a Williamsburg tavern keeper, is not simply an owner. She is embedded in the economic and social circulation of the capital. Her house is a node. A theft from her household is not isolated. It touches community expectations about control. People in her position are not powerless petitioners. They have access. They can speak to people who can speak to people. That's one lever. Second, the general court itself is a lever. Its deadlock is a public institutional embarrassment. A tie among judges is not a private disagreement. It is an exposed seam. Third, Gooch and the council have the ultimate lever: executive resolution. They can close the file, and they can close it in a way that leaves the colony's narrative intact. Fourth, and this is crucial, the empire is a lever even when it doesn't act. Referred to England is a signal. It tells the local elite that the case has become delicate enough to invoke London. Delicate cases generate reputational fear. Reputational fear generates pressure. So when we talk about confrontation letters in this story, we need to understand them as a category of force, whether or not the exact text survives in a neat bundle. In a system built on paperwork, demands often appear as correspondence, petitions, formal queries, or counsel's arguments disguised as legal briefs. The colony's response to those demands is what we can see. The rapid assembly of counsel, the elevation of the case, the escalation outward, and then the executive solution that avoids a definitive judicial ruling. That sequence is the confrontation. The paper trail is the receipt of pressure. Now, consider what a demand would have to insist on for the counsel to act the way it did. It would have to insist on certainty. It would have to insist on closure. It would have to insist that the colony not allow its highest court to appear evenly split over a fundamental question of privilege. It would have to insist that property relations remain unambiguous. If an enslaved person commits a felony, punishment should reaffirm mastery, not complicate it. And it would also have to insist, quietly, pragmatically, that the colony not invite imperial scrutiny by making the wrong kind of spectacle in the capital. Here's the prosecutorial reading. May 6, 1731 is not the date the colony discovered compassion. It is the date the colony solved a governance problem. The condition attached to the pardon proves it. Sold out of the colony is not a generous idea. It is a disposal method that protects the colony from the consequences of its own debate. It ensures Mary cannot remain in Virginia to become an emblem. She cannot become the enslaved woman who made them argue. She cannot become the enslaved woman spared by Scripture. She cannot become the enslaved woman denied a privilege reserved for others. She becomes none of these because she is removed before any of these narratives can stabilize around her. And what does that removal do for the people with leverage? For the owner class, it preserves the lesson. An enslaved person who transgresses still loses everything, including place, community, and any fragile ties. For the legal class, it preserves flexibility. The general court does not have to produce a final ruling that might bind future cases. For the executive class, it preserves the veneer of benevolent governance. The lieutenant governor and council can claim they spared a life, as if they are guardians of moderation. For the colony as an institution, it preserves its performance of English law without the dangerous implications of actually extending English legal privileges into the realm of enslaved personhood. Now listen to what the archive does not say, because silence is evidence in this genre. The archive does not say Mary was freed. The archive does not say Mary was rehabilitated. The archive does not say Mary returned to any community. The archive does not say Mary remained in Virginia under supervision. The archive says she is to be sold out of the colony. That is the colony choosing the one outcome that eliminates follow-up. Once she is gone, there is no obligation to document her condition, no obligation to revisit the legal question, no obligation to explain anything to anyone who might ask later. The story ends because the witness is shipped away. This is the chilling core of the confrontation letters segment. The institution only admits complexity under pressure, and it only resolves that complexity by protecting itself. You can see this pattern even without a single dramatic sentence preserved in quotation marks. The system's defensive posture is in its speed, in its vagueness, in its reliance on executive closure rather than judicial clarity. A confident institution produces rulings. A threatened institution produces conditions. And Mary Aggie's conditional pardon is the most honest thing the colony ever says about what it values. It values stability over justice. It values reputation over truth. It values the continuity of its hierarchy over the life that forced it to expose that hierarchy. There is another layer here that people avoid because it sounds too stark. But this is a dark record, and we don't sanitize it. Exporting Mary out of the colony is not just removal, it is escalation of risk. To be sold away is to be cut from whatever familiarity exists, however thin. It is to be placed in the hands of an unknown buyer. It is to enter a market where the only promise is extraction. The colony spares her from one sanctioned form of death by handing her to another environment where death can be slower, quieter, and less documented. In that sense, the colony's mercy is not mercy at all. It is a transfer of liability. And it is also, in the most literal sense, a disappearance strategy. Because once she is sold elsewhere, Virginia's archive can stop tracking her. That is the point. The record remains clean. The statute can later be debated. The privilege can be expanded in language. The names of officials can remain preserved in their proper titles. But Mary's name, Mary Aggie, can fade back into the category the colony prefers. Unnamed labor, uncounted outcomes, unrecorded endings. So when I describe this crisis window as the peak event, I am not talking about chaos in the streets. I am talking about the moment elite governance is forced to reveal its true instincts. April 1731. The law stalls, split 6-6. May 6th, 1731. The executive closes the file with a condition designed to erase. This is the confrontation. Not a shouting match, but a collision between a human life and an institution's need to keep its story coherent. And here is the moral lesson that we are obligated to say plainly, because silence is what the policy wants. When a system can resolve its contradictions by exporting the person who embodies them, it will do it again and again. It will do it under different names: transportation, removal, sale, relocation, administrative transfer, but the structure remains the same. The institution survives by moving the vulnerable out of frame. Mary Aggie is not just the subject of a legal argument. She is the cost of a legal argument. Her life becomes the bargaining chip that allows Virginia to postpone the moral reckoning and proceed to the next page. And our job in exhuming this record is not to admire how clever the procedure was. Our job is to name the procedure for what it is: an erasure mechanism that wears the mask of governance. Because the moment you accept pardon without reading the condition, you become part of the same silence. The moment you praise the colony for mercy without naming the sale out of Virginia, you help finish the work the archive began. And if we are going to speak over buried records at all, then we have one responsibility: to refuse the clean narrative, to keep the condition visible, and to say the part the paperwork tried to bury. May 6th, 1731, was the day Virginia saved its own face by disappearing the woman who threatened to show it. Now we have to look the cover-up in the face, because this is where people try to soften the story into an unfortunate gap in documentation. No. What happened to Mary Aggie is not a single missing document. It is a method. A repeatable set of procedures that convert a human crisis into an institutional victory, then lock the human being out of the narrative. This is not the romance of a secret cabal. It is something colder. A bureaucracy that doesn't need to conspire loudly because it already shares the same priorities: stability, property, reputation, and the quiet rule beneath all of it. When the record becomes dangerous, the record is managed. Start with the euphemism that does most of the work: sold out of the colony. That phrase is the colonial equivalent of a sealed door. It sounds administrative, almost mundane, like shipping, like commerce. like an arrangement. It is, in fact, a sentence engineered to end curiosity. It tells you what was done to her without giving you the data needed to trace it. No ship name, no purchaser, no destination, no date of departure, no chain of custody, no aftermath. It is not a narrative detail. It is a containment device. It was designed for the minutes, not for the conscience. And notice who benefits from that containment. If Mary remains in Virginia, the legal question remains alive. Can an enslaved woman plead benefit of clergy? If she is executed, the colony risks looking like it is rejecting its own Christian performance in English legal inheritance when it becomes inconvenient. If she is spared by a clean judicial ruling, the colony risks teaching the enslaved population that law can be invoked, not merely endured. So the system chooses the option that prevents all three outcomes from becoming precedent in the wrong way. Spare her life, remove her body, and preserve the colony's narrative flexibility. The result is May 6th, 1731. A pardon that is really an exile by sale. It is the perfect cover because it can be described as mercy while functioning as erasure. This is silence as procedure in its most efficient form. You do not need to burn files. You do not need to falsify every line. You only need to push the crucial person beyond the jurisdiction where questions could be asked. Then let paperwork do what paperwork does best. Finalize, archive, forget. Now look at the second mechanism. Jurisdiction laundering. April 1731. The General Court bench divides 6-6. A deadlock at that level is an exposed seam. The colony's highest judicial forum, in the heart of its capital, cannot agree. That is not merely an internal debate. It is a reputational vulnerability. So the case is referred to England. Referral sounds like deference to authority. But as a mechanism, it accomplishes two things at once. It delays decision-making, and it relocates accountability upward while keeping the human being trapped downward. If England eventually rules, Virginia can say, "We only followed." If England never rules quickly enough, Virginia can say, "We had to act." Either way, Virginia protects itself from owning the moral conflict in a definitive, quotable ruling. And then, when delay becomes its own danger, executive power steps in. That is the third mechanism. Administrative override. The Governor's Council and Lieutenant Governor do not resolve the legal doctrine. They resolve the political problem. They do not answer whether Mary can plead benefit of clergy. They remove Mary so the question loses its urgency. Executive action becomes the broom that sweeps the courtroom's indecision under the rug. This is how multiple people can participate without any single person needing to declare, "We are covering this up." Each actor can tell himself he is doing his job. The judges vote. The lieutenant governor escalates. The council pardons. The market absorbs the exported body. The clerks file the minutes. No villain in a cape. Just a system that knows what it wants preserved. The fourth mechanism is missingness disguised as normal. In archives, there are honest losses, fires, floods, decay. But there is also strategic absence. The parts of a case that would make it traceable are not preserved with the same care as the parts that protect the institution. Look at what survives cleanly in Mary Aggie's story. Dates of proceedings, the fact of a conviction, the value of stolen goods, the deadlocked bench, the referral to England, the conditional pardon, the later statute change. These are the institution's milestones, events that can be referenced as governance. Look at what does not survive in the same way. Mary's destination, her buyer, her life afterward. The colony preserved what made itself legible and allowed the person to become illegible again. That pattern is not random. It is policy expressed through preservation. The fifth mechanism is moral laundering, turning coercion into compassion by controlling the vocabulary. Pardon. Benefit. Clergy. Even Christianity, when used as a credential rather than a bond of moral obligation. These words create an aura of righteousness around decisions that are structurally violent. The colony does not free Mary, it sells her away. The colony does not incorporate her as a legal subject, it uses her as a test case. The colony does not affirm her humanity, it affirms its own image as moderated and civilized. This is the dirty secret of humane paperwork. It can do harm with a clean pen. And then comes the sixth mechanism, the one that turns this from a single case into a machine. Statutory capture. On July 1st, 1732, barely 14 months after Mary is conditionally pardoned and exported, Virginia's General Assembly passes a law that expands the ability to plead benefit of clergy to virtually all Virginians, except where barred under English or Virginia statutes. In passing, the legislature refers to Mary Aggie's cases, not as a tribute, not as a record of harm, as a rationale, as fuel. This is the system eating the person and excreting a statute. Here is where the cover-up becomes almost sacred in its cruelty. The law remembers the doctrine, not the woman. The law remembers the machinery, not the body caught in it. And the same statute that seems to expand access also hardens exclusions for enslaved people, free black people, and Indians for a growing list of felonies. That is how the colony protects itself. It widens the privilege in general language while tightening the noose in targeted applications. The public can praise the colony's sophistication. The vulnerable still bleed in silence. This is not contradiction. This is design. Now pause and absorb the timeline, because dates are the spine of accountability. November 7th, 1730. Convicted for stealing 3 sheets valued at 40 shillings from Annie Sullivan's house. April 1731. Attorneys argue. The bench splits 6-6. Gooch refers the case to England. May 6th, 1731. Gooch and counsel pardon her on condition she be sold out of the colony. July 1st, 1732. The Assembly passes a law that expands benefit of clergy broadly while drawing sharper boundaries around who is truly safe from death and the severest penalties. A year and a half. That's how quickly a human life can be converted into a policy instrument, and how quickly the instrument can be put back in the drawer. So what does a cover-up look like here? It looks like the colony refusing to let the story end in court, because court endings are traceable. It looks like the colony choosing an executive ending, because executive endings can be framed as mercy and sealed with silence. It looks like the colony preserving dates and doctrines while letting the person dissolve. It looks like the colony using the case as a reference point in legislation while refusing to carry the moral cost of the reference. If you are looking for a hidden annex labeled "Do Not Read," you will miss the real mechanism. The real mechanism is that the archive itself is structured to protect power. The disappearance is not an accident inside the archive. It is one of the archive's functions. And now comes the part that should make you angry in a different way. The second discovery. Because people like to believe cover-ups are a one-time sin that history eventually corrects. But the pattern in buried record stories is not correction. It is repetition. Someone finds something. Someone decides it's too sensitive. Someone seals it again. The vocabulary changes. The result does not. Jump forward. 30, 50, 80 years. The people in the chambers change. The wigs go out of fashion. Revolutions and reforms reorganize the language of government. But the colonial habit remains. Preserve institutional legitimacy, and let the human cost blur. In later decades, benefit of clergy itself becomes a target of modernization. It begins to fade as penal systems reform. You can measure its disappearance not as a moral awakening but as an administrative evolution. Lawmakers decide that old privileges, old fictions, old escape hatches don't fit the new order. By 1796, benefit of clergy begins to disappear from Virginia law. Yet, even as it erodes, enslaved people still retain limited rights to make the plea for a time, like a ghost limb of an old system that refuses to die cleanly. Then, in 1849, the ability to plead benefit of clergy is abolished from Virginia law entirely. The doctrine has a timeline. The doctrine gets a clean ending. Mary Aggie does not. Now imagine what these decades of reform require behind the scenes. Clerks pulling old volumes, legislators referencing old statutes, legal compilers assembling past enactments into authoritative texts. This is where the second discovery happens, not with shovels in a field, but with hands in a stack of paper. A brittle page, a marginal note, a passing reference to the cases of Mary Aggie, reduced to a phrase that does not contain her life, only her utility. The reformers are not looking for her. They are looking for doctrine. And in finding doctrine, they find her shadow. But what do they do with the shadow? They do what institutions do. They abstract it. They turn a human being into an example, then strip the example of its blood. They say, in effect, this case illustrates a problem in the law. And then they fix the problem in the law while leaving the person in the case unaddressed. That is the second burial. Not the burial of a body, but the burial of meaning. Think about it. Mary Aggie's case, in 1731, is volatile because it forces a court to confront who can be spared. By the late 18th and 19th centuries, the same case can be referenced safely because the danger has been neutralized. The person is gone. The living witnesses are gone. The social shock has passed. The case can now be handled as a technical antecedent. This is how time becomes a disinfectant for violence. It allows institutions to reframe harm as history and then congratulate themselves for improving procedure. And sometimes, in these later decades, a private record surfaces, not because the institution wants it, but because someone inside the machinery couldn't swallow the silence completely. A clerk makes an extra copy. A lawyer keeps notes. A family saves a bundle of papers. A marginal annotation survives in a volume that should have been trimmed, rebound, cleaned. The existence of such private remnants is what haunts official narratives, because they prove the truth was not unknown. It was merely unmanaged. It was known enough to be contained. But even when those fragments surface, what repeats is the choice. Reseal. Reclassify. Summarize into harmlessness. Refer to the doctrine, not the person. This is the institutional reflex. If a detail threatens reputation, convert it into a footnote or cut it out. If you cannot cut it out, bury it under general language. If you cannot bury it under general language, call it uncertain and move on. That is why the second discovery matters in this story. Not because it gives us Mary back, we do not get her back, but because it proves the continuity of the same decision across generations. In 1731, Mary's body is exported to protect Virginia's narrative. In 1732, her case is absorbed into statute while her fate is omitted. In later decades, as the doctrine is revised and eventually abolished, The system continues to treat her as a tool for legal explanation rather than a human being owed remembrance. The archive modernizes. The moral debt remains unpaid. And here is the prosecutorial conclusion of these sections. The cover-up mechanism is not one act of hiding. It is a chain of choices that all point in the same direction. The colony, then the state, then the legal tradition. Each layer preserves its own coherence by sacrificing the individual. Each layer calls it something different. Pardon. Sale. Statutory reform. Abolition of privilege. But the underlying pattern is the same. Institution first, person last. So, when you hear that Virginia expanded benefit of clergy on July 1st, 1732, do not let the word expanded seduce you. Ask what else expanded with it. The list of felonies for which slaves, free blacks, and Indians could not plead the privilege. Ask what expanded in the archive. The law's self-justification. Ask what shrank. The traceability of Mary Aggie's life. Ask what was exported. The witness. Ask what was reburied. The meaning. Because the real horror of buried records is not that the past is hard to know. The real horror is that the past was made hard to know on purpose, and that later generations kept honoring that difficulty as if it were natural. It isn't. Silence has authors. Policy has fingerprints. And Mary Aggie's case, from 1730 to 1849, carries the same message if you refuse to look away. The system was willing to reform the law, but not willing to preserve the person it used to justify the reform. That is not an oversight. That is the indictment. By the time a story like this reaches us, it has already been processed, trimmed, summarized, made respectable. What you receive in the public record is rarely the raw wound. It is the scar tissue shaped into a lesson that the institution can live with. That's why the next phase is always the same in buried record narratives. The private archive appears, not as a miracle, but as an accusation. A box of papers that should not exist. Marginal notes that survive despite the system's preference for clean margins. A draft chapter that never made it into print. And when you track those private traces, you realize something worse than ignorance. That the truth was known, then strategically scattered. So, let's talk about the private archive in Mary Aggie's case, because this story does not end in 1732 with the statute. The statute is simply where the institution places its signature over the crime of forgetting. What follows is 2 centuries of controlled memory, where the law's evolution is preserved as a proud timeline while the human being at the center is treated as a disposable footnote. That imbalance does not happen naturally. It requires maintenance. Here is what the public story can tell you without flinching. Mary Aggie is recorded as enslaved in Williamsburg by 1717, likely the property of Susanna Allen. In the late 1720s, she sues for freedom and loses. Lieutenant Governor William Gooch presides and is satisfied she demonstrates Christian belief. On November 7, 1730, she is convicted of stealing 3 sheets valued at 40 shillings from her owner, Annie Sullivan, a Williamsburg tavern keeper. In April 1731, 4 of 5 attorneys arranged for her argue before the general court that she can plead benefit of clergy. The bench ties 6-6. Gooch orders referral to England. On May 6, 1731, Gooch and the council pardon her on the condition she be sold out of the colony. On July 1, 1732, the Assembly passes a law broadening benefit of clergy while sharpening exclusions for slaves, free blacks, and Indians in felony categories. Then, much later, benefit of clergy begins to fade around 1796 and is abolished in Virginia law in 1849. That is the official spine. Dates, courts, titles, outcomes. But the official spine is not a body. It is a diagram. And diagrams are what institutions prefer because diagrams don't ask for funerals. What the public story cannot give you, what it refuses to give you, is Mary's after. It cannot tell you which ship carried her out. It cannot tell you which market received her. It cannot tell you who bought her, where she was taken, what name she was forced to answer to next, whether she lived long enough to see another winter, whether she died in a place that did not even bother to record her first name. The public archive ends her life not with a death certificate but with a phrase, "Sold out of the colony." That phrase is a procedural guillotine. It severs the narrative cleanly. It is the colony's method of mercy without responsibility. So where does the private archive come in? It comes in where human beings refuse to let a person become a doctrine. It comes in the form of reconstruction attempts, historians, legal scholars, public history institutions, trying to stitch together what the state left in fragments. It comes in oral histories and community memory, the human archive, which does not need ship manifests to understand what sold out means. It comes in the uncomfortable work of reading between the lines of statutes and council minutes and asking, what did this do to a person? But private archives do not survive because institutions love them. They survive despite institutions. They survive because someone, at some point, felt the dissonance. A clerk kept copies. A lawyer left notes. A researcher wrote a chapter that became too sensitive or too speculative or outside scope. The phrase changes with the era, but the function stays constant. Remove the part that makes the institution look like it protected itself at the expense of a human being. This is where the deleted chapters begin. Imagine a researcher in the 20th century or early 21st, working on colonial Virginia law, building an argument about benefit of clergy. They pull statutory compilations. They track the 1732 law. They see the passing reference to Mary Aggie's cases. They go backwards. 1731 council action, April 1731 deadlock, November 1730 conviction, late 1720s, freedom suit. They start to realize that Mary is not merely a legal anecdote. She is the fulcrum that allowed a political solution to disguise itself as doctrinal refinement. The researcher drafts it that way. They write the uncomfortable sentence. The colony used an enslaved woman's case to adjust its legal machinery and then exported her to erase the complication. And then the pressure begins. Sometimes the pressure is direct. Remove that section or we can't publish. Sometimes it's softer. Tighten the tone. Avoid moral claims. Stick to doctrine. Don't speculate. Don't assign motive. But notice what those editorial demands do in this context. They sound like scholarly rigor. They sound like caution. Yet they produce the same outcome as 1731. The system saves itself by removing the dangerous part of the story. In 1731, the dangerous part is Mary's presence in Virginia. In modern scholarship, the dangerous part is a narrative that makes colonial leadership look calculated rather than benevolent. The mechanism changes. The instinct does not. So the researcher capitulates, at least publicly. They cut. They condense. They turn Mary into an example rather than a human being. They reframe her conditional pardon as a legal outcome rather than a reputational strategy. They keep the story inside the safe fence of doctrine. But they save the pages. They keep a draft. They keep notes. They place them in a box. That box becomes the private archive that later surfaces, maybe in an estate donation, maybe in a university special collection, maybe in an overlooked folder labeled too generically for anyone to have cared until now. And when that box surfaces, you see the truth in its rawer form. Not just what happened, but what was too uncomfortable to say loudly at the time. That saved draft, those saved pages, are the hinge of tragedy in this genre. Because they prove something. Truth existed in coherent form, then was deliberately scattered to protect comfort. Now, in Mary Aggie's case, we don't need to invent a single heroic historian or a single dramatic showdown to understand the pattern. The pattern is visible in how the public story is told even now. It emphasizes the statute. It emphasizes benefit of clergy's expansion and eventual abolition. It emphasizes Gooch's role as if he were a moderating influence. It can even emphasize Mary's Christianity as if that detail proves the system had a soul. These are safe emphases. They allow the institution, Virginia's legal heritage, colonial governance, the archive itself, to be admired. They do not require us to sit with the moral cost. That Mary was spared only by being sold away, that the colony refused to carry her presence, that her life became an instrument used to polish the law. A private archive, when honestly handled, flips the emphasis. It says, the statute is not the hero. The statute is the evidence. It says, Gooch's mercy is not the climax. Gooch's condition is the indictment. It says, Mary's Christianity is not a comforting detail. It is the colony's credentialing device, a way to allocate mercy without conceding equality. It says, the disappearance after May 6th, 1731 is not unfortunate. It is functional. It is how the system ends the story without answering to it. And then we arrive at the modern technical report, the contemporary descendant of all that polished administrative language. Because even when the legal doctrine fades, even when benefit of clergy is abolished by 1849, institutions don't stop managing sensitivity. They just learn to do it with newer vocabulary. A modern report might not use the phrase sold out of the colony, but it knows the same trick. Recommend against disturbance. Recommend against reopening, recommend against digging. It uses words like sensitivity, insufficient documentation, risk, reputational harm, community impact, legal exposure. It sounds responsible. It sounds careful. And sometimes it is careful in the narrow sense. But in buried record history, careful often means do not force the institution to confront what it did. So imagine the modern era inquiry into Mary Aggie's paper trail. It begins as scholarship, maybe public history. It looks for follow-up records, shipping logs, sale notices, merchant records, auction listings, insurance inventories, plantation ledgers in other colonies. And what does it find? An absence that is structural. Because enslaved people exported through commerce rarely carry consistent identifiers across jurisdictions. Names change. Owners rename. Ages are approximated. Spellings mutate. A woman called Mary Aggie in Williamsburg can become Mary elsewhere, or Aggie elsewhere, or not Mary at all. That is not a coincidence. That is how slavery protected itself. By treating identity as a removable tag. When identity is a tag, tracking becomes almost impossible unless the institution wants it to be possible. So the modern report arrives at a conclusion that sounds neutral. No further traceable documentation has been located regarding Mary Aggie's subsequent whereabouts after her removal from the colony. That sentence is clean. It is also morally obscene, because it frames a human disappearance as a research inconvenience. It makes the system's success at erasure sound like a scholar's failure. And then comes the recommendation, the modern echo of 1731's condition. We recommend against further speculative identification. We recommend against asserting a destination without definitive records. We recommend focusing on documented legal impact rather than unverified personal outcomes. Again, it sounds rigorous, but it accomplishes the same thing the colony wanted. It keeps Mary confined to the role of a doctrinal footnote. It keeps her life as an instrument rather than a story. It keeps the institution safe from the uncomfortable question. If you can track statutes to the day, July 1st, 1732, why can't you track the woman whose case helped produce them? Here is the continuity, laid bare. In 1731, the institution faces a dangerous question. Can she plead benefit of clergy? And it resolves it by removing her from the colony. In the modern era, the institution faces another dangerous question. Where did she go, and what does that reveal about mercy? And it resolves it by recommending against disturbance, against excavation of the narrative, against reopening the wound, against forcing the archive to become accountable for the life it swallowed. This is why I reject the comforting story that time automatically corrects injustice. Time does not correct. Time allows institutions to polish. Time allows them to exchange blunt phrases for professional ones. Time allows them to say insufficient documentation instead of, we exported her and stopped caring. Time allows them to say sensitivity instead of, we cannot afford to look guilty. Now, I am going to be explicit about what we can and cannot claim, because the moral voice in this genre must be disciplined. We can claim documented dates and actions. 1717 presence in Williamsburg as property of Susanna Allen, late 1720s freedom suit. November 7th, 1730, conviction for stealing 3 sheets valued at 40 shillings from Annie Sullivan. April 1731 arguments and deadlocked bench. May 6th, 1731, conditional pardon requiring sale out of the colony. July 1st, 1732 statute change, later decline around 1796, abolition in 1849. Those are fixed points in the record. We can claim that the system used euphemism and conditional mercy to remove her. We can claim that her trace disappears precisely where the institution's accountability would begin. We can claim that later legal history preserves the doctrine more carefully than the person. What we cannot claim, because the institution made sure we cannot claim it, is where she was sold, who bought her, what she suffered next. That is not a natural unknown. It is an unknown produced by choices. And that is where the moral obligation sits. Not in pretending we can fill every gap, but in refusing to treat the gaps as innocent. Because if we accept the modern report's recommendation against disturbance, if we accept do not speculate as a substitute for do not forget, we become collaborators in the same project that began in 1731. We help convert a human life into a doctrinal anecdote. We help the institution keep its clean margins. Mary Aggie's case is often recited as a legal curiosity. I am telling you, it is a blueprint. It shows you how a government can protect its legitimacy while sacrificing an individual. It shows you how a statute can be built on a disappearance. It shows you how scholarship can be pressured into politeness. And it shows you how modern institutions can continue the same pattern under new vocabulary. Not reburial with shovels, but reburial with recommendations. So when you hear the phrase, we recommend against, when you hear insufficient documentation, sensitivity, best practice, scope limitations, do not let it lull you. Ask the older question hiding underneath. Who benefits from not knowing? Who benefits from the story ending at the moment the institution chose? Who benefits when Mary Aggie is remembered as a legal trigger, but not remembered as a person? And then do the one thing the system never wanted. Keep her name in the open longer than the archive intended. Keep May the 6th, 1731 attached to its condition. Keep July 1st, 1732 attached to the woman it used. Because the only counter-policy to institutional silence is deliberate remembrance. Here is where we stop letting the institution hide behind complexity. Here is where we separate what can be proven, what can be inferred, and what was engineered to remain unknown. Not because we enjoy uncertainty, but because uncertainty is one of the tools that power uses to keep its hands clean. When a record is thin, the comfortable response is to shrug and say, "We'll never know." That shrug is how silence survives for centuries. We will not shrug. We will name the limits, and we will name the reason for the limits. We can prove the spine of events, and the spine is enough to convict the system's intent. In 1717, an enslaved adult woman named Mary Aggie is recorded in Williamsburg as the property of Susanna Allen. That establishes her presence in the colonial capital long before the cases that made her legible to law. In the late 1720s, an enslaved woman named Mary Aggie sues for her freedom and loses, with Lieutenant Governor William Gooch presiding. We can prove that because the narrative of her failed suit persists as part of the official reconstruction, and because it is tied to another detail: Gooch's satisfaction with her demonstration of Christian belief. We can prove that on November 7th, 1730, she is convicted by the York County Court of Oyer and Terminer for stealing 3 sheets valued at 40 shillings from the house of her owner, Annie Sullivan, a Williamsburg tavern keeper. We can prove that this kind of crime ordinarily would have meant death or severe corporal punishment. We can prove that in April 1731, 4 of the 5 attorneys arranged for her argue before the general court that she has the right to plead benefit of clergy, and that when the bench moves to rule, it splits 6-6. We can prove that Gooch orders the case referred to England. We can prove that before a final verdict is rendered, on May 6, 1731, Gooch and the Governor's Council pardon Mary Aggie on the condition that she be sold out of the colony. We can prove that on July 1, 1732, the General Assembly passes a law that expands the ability to plead benefit of clergy for virtually all Virginians except where barred, and that it also adds to the number of felonies for which slaves, free black people, and Indians cannot plead benefit of clergy. We can prove that benefit of clergy begins to disappear from Virginia law around 1796 and is abolished entirely in 1849. These dates do not float. They are anchored. They are the institution's own calendar of decisions. And that calendar is the evidence. Now, what can we infer, carefully, ethically, without fantasy? We can infer that Mary Aggie's life was used as a legal instrument, not because we can read the men's private thoughts, but because we can observe their behavior. Institutions reveal intent through pattern. The pattern here is unmistakable. When Mary is a freedom suit petitioner in the late 1720s, the system rejects her and continues. When she becomes a convicted felon in 1730, the system should proceed to severe punishment. But instead, leadership intervenes, arranges legal advocacy, elevates the case, and tries to route her through an English privilege associated with literacy and clerical status. That is not routine. That is strategic. We can infer that Gooch's concern was not simply Mary's life as a human life, but the kind of precedent her death or survival would set in the colony's capital. We can infer this because the crisis is not resolved with a clean judicial ruling. It is resolved with an executive pardon that avoids a definitive court decision and simultaneously removes Mary from the colony. A genuine commitment to principle would have ended in a ruling that clarified the doctrine. What we see is a maneuver that keeps doctrine flexible while eliminating the witness. That is the signature of reputational management. We can also infer that demonstrated Christianity functioned as a credential, a gatekeeping mechanism that allowed the administration to selectively extend procedural mercy while maintaining racial hierarchy. Again, we do not need to speculate about anyone's soul to say this. The record itself links her Christianity to Gooch's satisfaction, and then links Gooch's intervention to the attempt to secure benefit of clergy. Christianity is introduced not as salvation for Mary, but as justification for the system's chosen outcome. It is how the colony makes violence sound lawful and law sound moral. When Christianity is used that way, graded by authorities, deployed as eligibility, it becomes a tool of control. We can infer, too, that the phrase "sold out of the colony" was not a neutral administrative detail but a deliberate closure mechanism. It terminates traceability. It ends obligation. It severs community. It ensures that whatever happens next cannot rebound on Virginia's leadership as a continuing controversy. That is why it is attached to the pardon. It is a condition that protects the institution, not the person. Now we come to the third category, the unknowns, and this is where the moral indictment sharpens. What remains unknown is not merely unknown because time passed. It remains unknown because the system did not value the documentation of enslaved lives as lives. We do not know where Mary Aggie was sold. We do not know to whom. We do not know what ship carried her, what port received her, what name she was forced to answer to afterward, whether she was worked to death quickly or survived for decades under another owner, whether she ever saw Williamsburg again. We do not know if she had children. We do not know if she had a partner. We do not know what her body endured after the mercy that removed her. These are not romantic gaps for storytellers to fill. These are engineered absences. The institution documented the value of sheets and shillings. It documented the deadlock count of judges. It documented the date the council acted. It could have documented the chain of sale if it cared to preserve it for her sake. It did not. And that is the policy. Meticulousness for property and governance, looseness for black life. This is the point where people often try to soften the judgment. But that's just how records were kept. No. That is a choice disguised as inevitability. Records reflect priorities. Priorities reflect power. And power, in this case, made sure the woman at the center of the statute would not remain a person in the story. The colony allowed her to be a doctrinal trigger and then cut her loose into commercial darkness. So let's return to the cold open with clarity. The unsettling claim was that Mary Aggie did not simply lose a case. She was edited out of Virginia by design. After walking the spine of dates, after watching the institution maneuver around its own deadlock, after seeing the conditional pardon, that claim is not rhetorical. It is descriptive. May 6th, 1731 is the edit. Sold out of the colony is the redaction. The colony does not need to hide the fact that she was removed. It only needs to hide the consequences of removal. It writes the condition in plain sight and then refuses to keep the trail. That is how confident systems operate. They put the violence in the open, wrapped in administrative language, and rely on future generations to misread it as normal. And now the moral truth, stated without ornament. Institutional reputation was protected at human cost. The colony chose a solution that preserved its self-image, merciful, lawful, English, without surrendering its hierarchy. It avoided a judicial verdict that might bind it. It avoided an execution that might look cruel in the capital. It avoided letting an enslaved woman's case become a standing invitation for others to test the law. It chose a conditional pardon that removed Mary from the colony and thereby removed the most dangerous thing of all, a living reminder. We are not done until we name what that means for us. Now, because buried record history is not an antique puzzle. It is a moral practice. When you consume these stories as trivia, an interesting case that changed the law, you are doing what the institution trained you to do. You are admiring the statute and forgetting the woman. You are treating policy as the main character. That is exactly what the archive wanted. The archive preserved the statute carefully because the statute flatters power. It allowed Mary to dissolve because her continued existence would demand accountability. So, in the closing, we refuse that training. We do the opposite. We keep her name visible, and we keep it attached to the condition that was meant to erase her. Mary Aggie, late 1720s. She sues for freedom and loses under Gooch's gaze. November 7th, 1730. Convicted for stealing 3 sheets valued at 40 shillings from Annie Sullivan's house in Williamsburg. April 1731. Argued before the General Court. The bench deadlocks 6-6. Gooch refers it to England. May 6th, 1731. Pardoned by Gooch and counsel on the condition she be sold out of the colony. July 1st, 1732. Her cases are referenced as Virginia expands benefit of clergy broadly while tightening exclusions against enslaved people and other racialized groups. 1796. The privilege begins to fade. 1840. It is abolished. That is the reconstructed list, the fragmentary roll call of a life that the institution tried to compress into doctrine. And if you need a symbol to hold on to this one. The phrase, sold out of the colony. It is a small string of words that carries an entire architecture of cruelty. It is exile without name. It is punishment without spectacle. It is violence without blood on the courthouse steps. It is the colony exporting a problem and calling it mercy. It is the archive ending a life in passive voice. The names that refuse to disappear are the names we insist on speaking anyway. Mary Aggie. Susanna Allen. Annie Sullivan. William Gooch. These names matter not because they satisfy curiosity, but because they assign responsibility. A system hides best when its actions are depersonalized into the court, the council, the law. But the law is made by people. The council is made of men. The court is made of votes. 6-6. That deadlock is made of individual decisions. May 6th, 1731 is made of signatures. July 1st, 1732 is made of legislative choice. When we name the actors, we deny the institution its favored alibi. That no one was responsible because everyone was simply following procedure. And here is the final charge, the one that sits like a weight. We inherit these records, and we choose what they become. We can let them remain what they were designed to be, clean narratives that protect the institution. Or we can treat them as evidence and refuse the comfort of forgetting. To remember Mary Aggie properly is not to pretend we can rescue her from the past. It is to refuse the colony's last demand, that her story end where it is convenient for power. So if you're listening, comment where you're from, not as a gimmick, but as a roll call against erasure. And if you have a theory about where sold out of the colony sent her, say it out loud. Not because speculation is a substitute for proof, but because silence is a substitute for conscience. The archive won't finish the story. The institution never wanted it finished. But we can at least keep the question alive, because the question is the one thing the paperwork tried to kill. Where did she go? And what does it say about a society that could change a statute on July 1st, 1732, yet could not be bothered to carry a woman's name beyond May 6th, 1731?